Look, sweetheart, I don't care what the new diversity quotas say. This is my mat. On my mat, you're a liability until you prove otherwise, and right now, all I see is someone who's going to get a real operator killed. Is that clear? The crowd of sailors, sweating in the humid air of the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado training gymnasium, snickered nervously. They stood in a wide, deferential circle on the worn blue mats, the air thick with the smell of rubber, disinfectant, and exertion. Petty Officer Morgan said nothing. She simply stood in the center of that circle, a focal point of sudden, unwanted attention, her posture relaxed, but not slumped. Her gaze was fixed on the man who had just insulted her, Lieutenant Davis, a man whose crisp, new training uniform seemed to reject the ambient humidity that soaked everyone else's. He was all sharp angles and loud pronouncements, a walking billboard for his own perceived authority. She, by contrast, was an exercise in quiet anonymity. Her uniform was worn, faded by salt and sun, yet immaculately clean. She was of average height, with a build that was lean and functional rather than imposing. There was nothing about her that screamed warrior, nothing that would draw a second glance in a crowded mess hall. But the Fleet Master Chief, observing from the shaded doorway of the cavernous building, saw it. He saw the way her feet were perfectly balanced, the weight distributed with an unconscious grace that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. He saw the way her eyes, calm and gray as a morning sea, didn't just look at the lieutenant, but scanned him, indexing angles, noting his posture, his breathing, the subtle shift of his weight from one foot to the other. It was the predatory stillness of a creature that doesn't need to roar to be the most dangerous thing in the jungle. The lieutenant, blinded by the shine of his own rank and the reflection of his own prejudices, saw none of this. He saw a woman in a man's world, a checkbox on a form, an obstacle to the efficient completion of his training schedule. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in silence, not in boasting, but in action, type competence below. Lieutenant Davis paced before her, a smug smile playing on his lips as he addressed the assembled sailors. He saw himself as a mentor, a hard but fair instructor breaking down the soft edges of a new generation. In reality, he was a gatekeeper, one who had mistaken his petty authority for genuine wisdom. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. The modern battlefield is no place for hesitation. It is a place of violence, of action, of immediate and overwhelming force. The principles we teach here in hand-to-hand combatives are not theoretical. They are the bedrock of survival when your rifle runs dry, when the enemy is on top of you, when there is nothing left between you and oblivion but your training. He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words hang in the thick air. The sailors watched, some rapt, some intimidated. They were young, most of them fresh from boot camp or their first technical schools, and a commissioned officer still held a certain mystique. Davis represented the institution, the power structure they were all trying to navigate. His approval felt like a currency they desperately needed to earn. He turned back to Morgan, his smile tightening into a condescending smirk, which is why we cannot afford to carry dead weight. We cannot afford to lower our standards. Petty Officer Morgan here, through no fault of her own, represents a statistical disadvantage. He gestured to her generically. Smaller frame, lower muscle mass. It's simple biology, people. It's not an insult. It's a fact. And fact can get you killed if you ignore them. A few more sailors chuckled a low, uncomfortable sound. They were following his lead, aligning themselves with the perceived power in the room. Morgan's expression remained unchanged. Her face was a placid mask of professional neutrality. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Her breathing remained slow and even, a silent metronome counting down to a moment only she could foresee. The lieutenant took her silence as weakness, as confirmation of his assessment. So, we're going to use the petty officer to demonstrate a common grapple escape. This is a situation where a much larger, much stronger opponent has you pinned. Your technique has to be perfect. Your execution has to be flawless. There is no room for error. He moved toward her, his movements telegraphed and overly dramatic. He grabbed her arm in a grip that was far too tight for a simple demonstration, a petty assertion of physical dominance. And in that moment, the isolation of the quiet professional was complete. She was surrounded by peers who saw her as a punchline, and held by a superior who saw her as a prop. But her focus never wavered. It remained on the task, on the geometry of the problem presented to her, a problem she had solved 1,000 times before in places far darker and more dangerous than a brightly lit gymnasium. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a reservoir of immense, disciplined potential. The lieutenant began his lecture, his voice a droning monotone of technical jargon that he clearly enjoyed reciting. The attacker establishes a dominant frame here, he said, wrenching Morgan's arm to an awkward angle to emphasize his point. He uses his weight advantage to pin your arm, neutralizing your ability to strike or draw a secondary weapon. From here, he can control the engagement. He can strike, he can choke, he can create an opening to finish the fight. For the defender, he glanced at Morgan with a look of theatrical pity. The options are limited. The window for a successful counter is fractions of a second. It requires explosive power, perfect timing, and a level of aggression that, frankly, must be drilled into you. He was talking to the crowd, but his actions were directed at her. Each movement was a small act of humiliation, a physical manifestation of his verbal disdain. He wanted them to see her struggle. He wanted them to see her fail, to prove his point that she didn't belong. He wanted to be right, and he was willing to use her as the evidence for his own flawed argument. Now, the Standard Academy counter involves creating space, he continued, pushing his weight against her. You are taught to shrimp your hips, to create a wedge with your knee, to try and break the posture of the attacker. He looked around at the nodding sailors. This is fine in theory, but theory and reality are two different things. He leaned in closer to Morgan, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for the front row to hear. And the reality is, someone your size will never generate the force to move someone my size. It's physics. He shoved her slightly, expecting her to stumble, to lose her footing. She did not. Her body absorbed the force, her feet rooted to the mat, as if she were carved from the same dense rubber. It was like shoving against a deeply set pylon. A flicker of annoyance crossed the lieutenant's face, a brief crack in his confident facade. The demonstration wasn't going according to his script. She was supposed to be reactive, off balance, weak. Instead, she was a statue of calm, her body a perfect model of structural integrity. He decided to escalate. Let's try a more dynamic scenario. The attacker isn't just holding you. He's striking. His voice regained its authoritative boom. He's trying to disorient you, to break your will, to demonstrate. He swung his free hand in a slow, telegraphed arc toward her head, stopping just short of her face. You must control the striking limb, protect your head, and then, only then, can you attempt the escape. He repeated the motion, a little faster this time, a little closer. Morgan's eyes tracked the movement, her head moving just enough to be out of the path of the simulated blow, her economy of motion almost supernatural. There was no wasted energy, no panicked flinch. It was the calculated, precise response of a finely tuned machine. This infuriated him. Her competence was a silent refutation of his entire thesis. Her calm was an insult to his authority. He needed to break it. He needed to force a reaction that would validate his prejudice. You're not taking this seriously, petty officer, Lieutenant Davis snarled, his frustration finally boiling over. The pretense of a controlled, academic demonstration was gone, replaced by raw ego. On the battlefield, there are no slow-motion attacks. There are no pulled punches. There's only this. In a shocking breach of training protocol, his hand didn't stop. It wasn't a full-force blow, but it was far more than a tap. His open palm connected with the side of her jaw with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent gymnasium. It was a strike meant to stun, to humiliate, to force a yelp of pain or a show of fear. He struck her. The crowd gasped as one. A line had been crossed. This was no longer training. It was an assault. The nervous laughter died, replaced by a tense, horrified silence. Every sailor in the room knew what they had just seen was wrong, a gross abuse of power. They looked at each other, their eyes wide, then back at the two figures in the center of the mat. Lieutenant Davis held his position, his hands still in the air, a triumphant sneer on his face. He had gotten the reaction he wanted, not from her, but from the audience. He had proven his point about the harsh realities of combat, but he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed her stillness was passivity. He had assumed her silence was fear. He had assumed her gender was a synonym for weakness. He was wrong on all counts. For a single, eternal second, nothing happened. The sound of the slap hung in the air, a dissonant chord in the quiet room. Morgan's head had barely moved from the impact. And then it began. It was not a movement of anger or retaliation. It was a movement of pure, cold, professional duty. It was the response of an apex predator that has been prodded one too many times. Her body, which had been a study in placid stillness, became a blur of devastating efficiency. The hand that Davis was still gripping with such confidence suddenly had no wrist to hold. In a motion too fast to follow, she had rotated her palm, broken his grip, and established her own, securing his wrist with a thumb and forefinger on a precise pressure point. Simultaneously, her other hand, the one that had been hanging loosely at her side, came up, not in a fist, but with fingers extended and rigid, striking the brachial plexus origin on the side of his neck. It wasn't a punch, it was a neurological shutdown command. The lieutenant's dominant arm went instantly numb, hanging uselessly at his side. A look of pure, uncomprehending shock washed over his face. Before he could even process the first two movements, she flowed into the third. Stepping not away, but into him, she used her hip as a fulcrum, redirecting his forward momentum. He was a big man, easily 60 pounds heavier than her, but physics, the very thing he had tried to lecture her on, was now her weapon. His center of gravity was compromised. His balance was gone. He was falling but not collapsing. She controlled his descent with terrifying precision, spinning under his now useless arm, ending up behind him. One arm snaked across his chest, her other hand cupping the back of his head. He landed on the mat not with a crash, but with a controlled thud flat on his back. She was kneeling on his chest, a knee pinning his remaining good arm, her forearm pressed firmly against his windpipe. It was not a choke designed to render him unconscious. It was a pin, a position of absolute and total control. He could not move. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. The entire sequence, from the moment he struck her to the moment he was neutralized on the mat, had taken less than 2 seconds. A deafening silence descended upon the gymnasium. It was a silence filled with awe, with fear, with the sudden, violent shattering of 1,000 assumptions. The sailors stared, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to reconcile the unassuming woman from moments before with the impossibly lethal force that had just been unleashed. Lieutenant Davis lay on the mat, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief, staring up at the calm, impassive face of the woman he had just assaulted. Her expression had not changed. There was no anger, no triumph, no emotion at all. There was only the quiet, focused competence of a professional who had just finished a job. From the shadows of the large bay door, a figure emerged, walking with a slow, deliberate cadence that commanded attention without demanding it. Fleet Master Chief Thorne stepped into the light, his own uniform a testament to a lifetime of service. It was perfectly starched, but the ribbons above his pocket told a story of decades spent in the harshest corners of the world. His face was a roadmap of experience, his eyes holding a wisdom that could not be learned from books. He surveyed the scene with a practiced, all-encompassing gaze, the stunned sailors, the lieutenant gasping on the mat, and the still, silent figure of Petty Officer Morgan, who remained in her position of control, her focus unbroken. Thorne's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the thick silence like a razor. Petty Officer, on your feet. It was a quiet command, but it held the weight of the entire fleet. Morgan disengaged from the lieutenant with the same fluid efficiency she had used to take him down. In one smooth motion, she was standing, her hands loosely at her sides, her posture once again relaxed but ready. She had not even been breathing heavily. Lieutenant Davis scrambled to his feet, shame and fury warring on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to offer some blustering excuse, but the Master Chief silenced him with a single, sharp glance. Thorne's eyes were like chips of ice. Not one word, Lieutenant. The words were spoken with a finality that left no room for argument. Davis's mouth snapped shut. Thorne walked a slow circle around the two of them, his eyes missing nothing. He looked at the red mark beginning to form on Morgan's jaw. He looked at the terror that still lingered in the lieutenant's eyes. He looked at the faces of the young sailors, who were just now beginning to process the lesson they had just received. He stopped directly in front of Morgan. He did not address the strike. He did not ask what had happened. He already knew. Instead, he looked at her stance, at the way she held herself. He looked at the technique she had just executed, a brutal but elegant cascade of movements that was not part of any standard Navy combative's curriculum. It was something else entirely, something refined and lethally pure. "What's your name?" "Petty Officer," he asked, his voice calm and inquisitive. "Morgan, Master Chief," she replied. Her voice was steady, devoid of emotion. It was the first time most of the sailors had heard her speak more than a single word. Thorne nodded slowly. "Morgan," he repeated, as if tasting the name. He turned to his aide, a young petty officer who had followed him out of the shadows, clutching a ruggedized military tablet. "Give me Petty Officer Morgan's service record. Full jacket. Tier 1 clearance." The aide's eyes widened slightly. Tier 1 was the highest level, reserved for the most sensitive and classified personnel files in the entire armed forces. He quickly began tapping on the tablet screen. The room waited, the tension almost unbearable. The sailors held their breath. This was no longer about a training exercise gone wrong. This was something more. They were on the precipice of a revelation, a moment where the curtain would be pulled back on a world they knew existed but had never seen. Lieutenant Davis stood rigidly, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He was beginning to understand that he had not just insulted a subordinate. He had stumbled into a world of shadows and secrets, and had committed a grave error against one of its silent inhabitants. The quiet competence he had dismissed was about to be given a name, a history, and a legacy that would crush his own arrogance into dust. The aide's tablet beeped softly, indicating the file had been accessed after a series of biometric and password verifications. He handed the device to the Master Chief. Thorne took it, his eyes scanning the screen. For a long moment, the only sound in the gymnasium was the distant hum of ventilation fans. The sailors watched his face, trying to read his expression. It was unreadable at first, a mask of professional scrutiny. Then, slowly, a look of profound, almost reverent respect began to dawn in his eyes. He looked up from the tablet, not at Morgan, but at the assembled crowd. He was no longer just an observer. He was a teacher, and class was now in session. For the benefit of those of you who have clearly forgotten the most fundamental tenets of our service, he began, his voice resonating with quiet authority, let me provide a lesson. The first tenet is respect. Respect for your shipmates, regardless of rank, gender, or appearance. The second is to never, ever make assumptions. He paused, letting the words sink in. He then turned his gaze directly onto Lieutenant Davis, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. You, Lieutenant, have failed on both counts today. Spectacularly, he lifted the tablet. You assume that because Petty Officer Morgan is a woman, she is weak. You assume that because she is quiet, she is timid. You assume that because her rank is lower than yours, you had the right to disrespect and assault her in front of her peers. He took a step closer to the lieutenant, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. You did not see a warrior. You saw a target for your own insecurities. You were wrong. Thorne turned back to the crowd. Let me tell you who you are looking at. He began to read from the tablet, his voice clear and precise, each word landing like a hammer blow. Name, Morgan, Specialist. First class. The room stirred. Specialist, not Petty Officer. It was a different pay grade scale, one used almost exclusively in the shadowy world of Naval Special Warfare. Unit designation, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, a collective, sharp intake of breath. DevGru, the formal name for SEAL Team 6. It was a unit so secretive that its very existence was often a matter of speculation. They were the tip of the spear's tip, the most elite operators in the entire U.S. military. The sailors stared at Morgan in stunned disbelief. This quiet, unassuming woman was one of them. It seemed impossible. Combat deployments. 7. Thorne continued, his voice relentless. Theaters of operation. Classified. Mission set. Classified. Special skills qualifications. Advanced close quarters combat instructor. Master breacher. Covert methods of entry specialist. Tier 1 operator. He lowered the tablet and looked directly at Morgan. He saw the faint, silvery scar just above her eyebrow, a detail he hadn't noticed before. He saw the coiled readiness in her frame. He saw the ghost of 100 battles in her calm, gray eyes. He saw a professional. Then, in a gesture that sent a shock wave through the room, Fleet Master Chief Thorne, a living legend with 30 years of service, a man who advised admirals, snapped to the most rigid and formal position of attention. He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. "Specialist Morgan," he said, his voice ringing with a respect so profound it was almost tangible. "My apologies for the unprofessional conduct of my officer. It will be dealt with. Thank you for your demonstration. The world had just been turned upside down. The institutional hierarchy, the very foundation of their world, had been inverted. A Master Chief was saluting a specialist. And in that moment, everyone understood. They were not in the presence of Sailor. They were in the presence of a legend. The legend of Specialist Morgan spread through the base, not like wildfire, but like a pressure wave from a distant explosion, silent, invisible, but powerful enough to shatter glass. It traveled not through official channels, but through the whispered conversations in mess halls, the hushed tones in barracks after lights out, the sudden, respectful silences that fell whenever she entered a room. The story became a modern fable, a piece of institutional folklore passed from sailor to sailor. It was told in 100 different ways, with each telling adding a new layer of mythic detail. In some versions, she had taken down 3 lieutenants. In others, she had done it blindfolded. The core of the story, however, remained unchanged. Quiet competence had faced loud arrogance, and arrogance had been left gasping on the mat. The sailors who had been there that day became minor celebrities in their own right, the keepers of the true story. They were sought out, asked to recount every detail. They described the sound of the slap, the impossible speed of her movements, the deafening silence that followed. But most of all, they described the look on Fleet Master Chief Thorne's face as he read her file, the dawning realization, the profound respect. And they spoke of his salute, a gesture that had corrected the moral compass of the entire base. Lieutenant Davis vanished. One day he was running the training schedule. The next his office was empty. The official word was that he had been reassigned to a staff position at the Pentagon, a promotion on paper that was, in reality, a form of exile. He was sent to a world of paper and politics, far from the operational world he so desperately wanted to be a part of. The unofficial story was that Master Chief Thorne had personally escorted him to the base commander's office for a conversation that had been described by a secretary outside as 10 minutes of complete silence, followed by 1 minute of quiet. Terrifying instruction. Davis was broken, his career trajectory permanently altered. He had not been court-martialed, but he had been handed a far worse sentence in the unforgiving culture of the military. He had been rendered irrelevant. His name became a cautionary tale, a verb used by instructors to describe the career-ending mistake of underestimating a quiet professional. To be a Davis was to be a fool blinded by your own ego. The training curriculum at the combatives facility was quietly updated. A new module was added, focusing on leverage-based takedowns against a larger opponent. It was officially designated Module 7B, Asymmetrical Grappling Techniques. Unofficially, everyone on the base, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned chief, called it the Morgan Counter. The blue mat where the incident had occurred became a kind of landmark. Someone, no one ever knew who, had taken a permanent black marker and drawn a small, simple star in the exact spot where the lieutenant's head had rested. It was a subtle memorial, a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had happened there. It was a reminder that the most important lessons are often the most painful, and that respect is not a right of rank, but a currency earned through character and competence. Specialist Morgan, for her part, seemed completely unaffected by the storm of whispers and rumors that now surrounded her. She was the calm eye of a hurricane of her own making. She continued her duties with the same quiet, methodical precision as before. She showed up to physical training on time. She cleaned her weapon with meticulous care. She spoke only when necessary, her words always direct and to the point. The awe and deference of the other sailors seemed to bemuse her more than anything else. They would part ways for her in the hallways, their eyes downcast with respect. They would fall silent when she sat at a table in the chow hall. They tried to give her space, to treat her like the living legend they now believed her to be. But Morgan didn't want reverence. She wanted normalcy. She was a professional in a world of professionals, and the sudden attention was an unwelcome distraction from the mission. One afternoon, a young sailor, a seaman barely out of his teens who had witnessed the incident, approached her in the weight room. He was nervous, stammering, his hands fidgeting. "Specialist Morgan, ma'am," he began. "I was there, in the gym. I just wanted to say that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen." Morgan was in the middle of a set of pull-ups, her movements smooth and controlled. She finished her set, dropped lightly to the floor, and turned to face him. Her gray eyes held no judgment, only a calm, neutral focus. "It was a textbook application of leverage and misdirection," she said, her voice even. "The technique is the point, not the person performing it." The sailor was taken aback. He had expected a story, a boast, or at least a knowing smile. Instead, he got a technical debrief. But the way you did it," he pressed on, "Lieutenant Davis, he never stood a chance." Morgan picked up a towel and wiped the sweat from her brow. "Assumptions are a liability," she said simply. "He made an assumption about me based on my appearance. That was his mistake. The technique just capitalized on it. Don't make the same mistake. Don't assume I'm special. Assume the training works. Focus on that." She then turned and walked away, leaving the young sailor standing in stunned silence. The lesson was clear. Her identity was not in her reputation, but in her discipline. Her worth was not defined by the stories told about her, but by the principles she embodied. The legend was about the action, not the actor. And in this way, she began to transform the culture of the base, not through her myth, but through her quiet, consistent example. She taught them that the ultimate power was not in being known, but in being prepared. The true professional doesn't need an audience. They need only a standard and the discipline to meet it every single day. Years passed. The story of Specialist Morgan and Lieutenant Davis solidified from recent memory into established folklore, a foundational myth for a new generation of sailors passing through Coronado. The star on the blue mat was still there, its edges faded, but its meaning undiminished. It was now pointed out to every new class of recruits on their first day of combatives training. The instructors, many of whom were now telling a story they had only heard secondhand, used it as their opening lesson. They would gather the nervous, impressionable young men and women in a circle around the star and begin the tale. "This spot on the mat," a grizzled chief petty officer would say, his voice low and serious. "We call this the Davis Mark. It's named after a lieutenant who used to teach here. A man who thought he knew everything. A man who confused the insignia on his collar with actual strength. He would let them absorb that, letting them look at their own pristine uniforms and the ranks on their own sleeves. He believed that respect was owed to him because of his rank. He believed strength was determined by size. He believed a person's worth could be judged by their gender. He learned, on this very spot, that all of his beliefs were wrong. He learned that respect is earned through competence. He learned that true strength is about leverage, not muscle. And he learned that the most dangerous person in the room is almost always the one who doesn't need to tell you they are. The story had become a powerful teaching tool, more effective than any training manual. It was a parable about the dangers of ego and the virtue of humility. It taught that the uniform was a symbol of responsibility, not a license for arrogance. The name Morgan was now spoken with a kind of reverence, not just for the woman herself, who had long since departed for other, more classified duties, but for the principle she represented. She was the embodiment of the quiet professional, a silent guardian whose actions had left a permanent and positive mark on the institution she served. The culture had shifted slowly but surely. Instructors were more mindful. Officers were more respectful. The sailors themselves were quicker to defend a shipmate from casual prejudice, quicker to look past the surface and judge a person by their actions and their work ethic. The lesson of that humid afternoon had rippled outwards, strengthening the core of the force in a way no new weapon system or technological advancement ever could. It had reinforced the simple, timeless truth that a fighting force is only as strong as the respect its members have for one another. The true legacy of Specialist Morgan was not the single, dramatic event in the gymnasium. It was not the humbled lieutenant or the whispered stories. Her legacy was the quiet, institutional change that followed. It was the young female sailor who now walked onto the training mat with confidence, knowing she would be judged by her skill and not her gender. It was the young officer who now listened to the advice of a seasoned enlisted professional, having learned that wisdom does not always correlate with rank. It was the culture of quiet competence that began to permeate the training command, a culture that valued precision over noise and action over words. Legacy isn't a statue or a plaque on a wall. It is not a story frozen in time. True legacy is a living thing. It is the continuation of a standard. It is the passing of a lesson from one generation to the next, becoming stronger and more refined with each telling. It is the silent, positive pressure that forces an institution to become a better version of itself. Specialist Morgan, wherever she was in the world, fighting in shadows and silence, would never know the full impact of her actions that day. And she wouldn't care. The quiet professional does not seek validation. They do not need their name remembered. Their reward is the continuation of the mission, the quiet satisfaction of a job done right, and the knowledge that the standards they live by will endure long after they are gone. The mark on the mat was not a monument to her, but a signpost for others, a permanent reminder that in the calculus of combat, and in the measure of a human being, assumptions are the enemy, and competence is the only currency that matters. It teaches us that the loudest voice in the room is often the most insecure, and that true strength, the kind that can change the world, is often found in the disciplined, deafening silence of a professional at work. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.